What's going on, guys? Today marks this channel's first top 5 list, and I'm generally going to prefer top 5 over top 10 just because top 5 I feel like makes room for honorable mentions, and it also just narrows it down to the Pokemon or things or whatever I'm talking about that really deserve it. So I'm generally not going to do top 10s unless the subject is just so vast that top 5 is not enough. But enough of that. As you can tell from the title, I'm going to be listing off the Pokemon that I think are the most influential in the competitive Pokemon scene, the standard competitive Pokemon scene, and by that I mean either Smogon OU or the official VGC format of Nintendo. Since this is a list of Pokemon that have greatly influenced the history of competitive Pokemon as a whole since its inception, don't expect to see any like 6th gen or Kalos Pokemon in this list, unfortunately, just because they haven't really been around long enough to impact the history of competitive Pokemon as a whole. But basically anything else is fair game. The first choice for my list has to be Mewtwo. Now, I know I talked about only including the impact on standard metagames like OU and VGC, and you might say, well, Mewtwo doesn't really fall into that category. But the thing is, Mewtwo, in a sense, was the birth of competitive Pokemon because Mewtwo defined an Uber for the first time. It was a Pokemon that in RBY was just completely busted in every definition of the word, both offensively, defensively, and as well as from the support aspect. In a way, it was the very first ban that Smogon implemented. Well, back then, it wasn't Smogon yet, it was Net Battle. Well, Mewtwo was the first completely banned Pokemon, and it is the very definition of overpowering and centralizing in an OU metagame. So that's like the inception of Smogon, as well as VGC ban policy, although in VGC 2010, when up to 2 legendaries were allowed, Mewtwo was often a popular choice. But since then, it hasn't made a reappearance in VGC, so that's why Mewtwo is only number 5 on this list, since its impact is mostly pertaining to Smogon policies. Number 4 on this list is going to be Tyranitar. Tyranitar is a Pokemon that has been exceptional competitively in every single generation that it has been in. It is the best Sandstorm user. It was possibly the first Pursuit user to come about, and it's been a defining force in both the OU and VGC metagames. In Gen 5, it was probably, although it was probably at a low point in viability in Gen 5 due to all the fighting types that were introduced, it was still one of the most defining factors in the Weather War aspect of Gen 5, being the best Sandstorm provider. And also the fact that it benefits from its own Sandstorm by boosting its special defense was pivotal with the unbanning of special powerhouses like Latios and the introduction of Pokemon such as Thundurus in Gen 5. And despite having a poor typing at face value, Tyranitar is a Pokemon that is blessed with an exceptional move pool and good all-around stats, with the exception of speed, which can be remedied with a Choice Scarf. So it's one of those Pokemon that has all-around, doesn't have a bad stat, and it's the example of what a solid Pokemon looks like in the OU metagame for many generations, as well as in VGC, so that's why it's number 4 on this list. Number 3 on this list may seem a little bit odd, especially with what I said about Pokemon not being around long enough to really impact the history of competitive Pokemon. There is one exception to this rule, and its name is Kangaskhan. Now you may be saying, wait, Kangaskhan is a Pokemon that was introduced in Gen 1, but the source of its immense influence didn't come about until Gen 6, obviously with Mega Evolution. Now, Kangaskhan was one of the first Mega Evolutions that we actually saw before the release of X and Y. I believe the first was Lucario, and Kangaskhan may have been the second, please correct me if I'm wrong. So Kangaskhan served as an introduction to possibly one of the most defining aspects of 6th gen and generations of competitive Pokemon to come. But what really makes Kangaskhan special is how explosively it arrived onto the competitive scene. It was initially overlooked as originally overlooked as a Mega just because Kangaskhan in its base form is not very impressive, but it explosively dominated OU during the period that it was allowed, and it remains as the single most powerful Pokemon in VGC 2014 and one of the most powerful in VGC 2015. So the amount of influence that Mega Kangaskhan had in just one generation is enough to make it to number 3 on my list. Number 2 on my list is Garchomp. Now, Garchomp is number 2 because it was the first Pokemon that was not a legendary Pokemon to be banned by Smogon, if I'm not mistaken. And so this really influenced how Smogon looked at their ban policy and what kind of preconceptions were broken by Garchomp dominating the metagame too much. It was also kind of the first Pokemon to introduce some speed creep to the metagame, because with Garchomp in the metagame, 100 base speed became less important since Garchomp was faster than that. And so that just made way for other Pokemon in Gen 5 that would add more to the speed creep, such as the Swords of Justice, the 108 tier, while Garchomp sat at 102 in Gen 4. Garchomp is very similar to Tyranitar because it's one of those Pokemon that has no bad stat. It has just a terrifying combination of power, bulk, and speed that has allowed it to perform well in every metagame that it was introduced in. Even during its time in the Ubers tier, it was not a bad choice for a Choice Scarfer just because of its great 102 speed tier that was really clutch in the Ubers metagame at the time. And it's also made a big splash in VGC as well. Along with Kangaskhan, it was probably one of the most important Pokemon of VGC 2014, mainly due to its combination of stats and a stab spread move, as well as a coverage spread move in Rock Slide, which is arguably one of the best attacking moves in doubles overall, as well as its excellent offensive typing of Dragon and Ground. So overall, its impact on both Smogon ban policy and its impact on VGC metagames has earned Garchomp's spot as the number 2 most influential Pokemon in competitive. Now, before I get to the number 1 most influential Pokemon in standard metagames, I want to give some honorable mentions that I really wanted to include on this list, but I ended up not picking just because either other Pokemon were more influential or because the scope of their influence was a bit too narrow. But nevertheless, these Pokemon deserve a mention. First of all is Snorlax, who I was actually almost going to put on this list just because of the huge impact it had on the earlier generations of competitive Pokemon, mainly Gen 2, where, I mean, see, it's one of those things where you can really start to see how Smogon has progressed in its banning process. If Smogon had the same mentality today as it did back then in Gen 2, Snorlax would probably be banned. But it's kind of a precedent not to change the past metagames too much. So Snorlax remains legal in Smogon singles, and it's still one of the most centralizing Pokemon in any generation ever. So definitely an honorable mention for that. Although its viability did dip severely after that. And then the second Pokemon is Keldeo, just because it defined what post Swift Swim ban Rain offense looked like in Gen 5, and it continues to be an influential Pokemon in Gen 6, as well as being like my most desired Pokemon for VGC since they ban events. So Keldeo is probably never going to be legal, even though I think it would be a great Pokemon in VGC. The third Pokemon on the honorable mentions list is Suicune, because it basically defined the classic bulky water, as well as for its famous Crocoon set, which after that has been emulated by other Pokemon like Mega Slowbro, for instance, or Spiritomb in earlier generations. I don't think that set is used as much now, but back then it did. And also Gengar, because it's performed exceptionally in every generation. It's been OU since its inception. The only Pokemon to be OU since Gen 1 still, consistently, without any drops. Then there's also Thundurus, which influenced the use of Swagger in VGC. It was the most popular user of the move overall due to having priority on it. It's one of the most important uses of priority Thunder Wave, which really affected how singles was played, and actually led to it being banned due to its combination of power and utility moves of Prankster in Gen 5. But it has returned in Gen 6 with a vengeance as one of the most powerful mixed attackers and utility attackers. And then next we have Heatran, one of the best anti-meta Pokemon of DPP, and continues to be a great influence in OU today as well as in VGC. which leads to the next Pokemon, a Pokemon that was more influential in VGC than anything else, Cresselia, the queen of doubles and VGC, just because of its sheer bulk and the amount of support it can provide. And then the last Pokemon in my honorable mentions is going to be Salamence, just because of its immense impact on 3rd Gen OU, as well as being another controversial ban of Diamond, Pearl, Platinum, and then also being probably one of the strongest ORAS Megas to be introduced. And my number one pick for the most influential Pokemon in the competitive standard metagame is Landorus. Landorus is kind of a curious choice, I know, because it's actually a Pokemon that was introduced quite recently in Gen 5. It's not a Gen 1 or Gen 2 Pokemon, which has had a long time to make its mark on competitive Pokemon. But the reason I chose Landorus is simply because of its sheer, just the amount of change it has undergone in terms of what set it's run with every transition in the metagame, and the way it has fit all of those transitions spectacularly in both the Smogon side and the VGC side. So when the Incarnate form was the only form available, Landorus was used in OU as a Sand Force attacker, sometimes with a Choice Scarf, and it was a really powerful wall breaker, but it was still kind of at a low point in viability compared to later transitions. The most notable one being Black and White 2, with the introduction of Landorus Therian and also the introduction of Sheer Force as Landorus Incarnate's Dream World ability. So this is what really made Landorus explode on the competitive scene. I believe Enosh Sashar, who is a renowned VGC player, said that Landorus Therian was the single Pokemon that made VGC 13 suck, or that broke VGC 13, or made it unhealthy, something along those lines. I'm not like quoting him directly, but he said something to that effect. And also, Landorus Incarnate with Sheer Force was powerful enough to be banned from 5th Gen OU, a ban that remains pretty controversial, but it's now S rank in 6th Gen OU, and is also looking at a potential suspect test, which would be completely justified because of its variety of offensive moves and also boosting moves. Like, it can run Rock Polish to destroy offensive teams, or it can run Calm Mind to just blow past defensive teams, and it has great coverage moves such as Knockoff to cripple potential checks such as Latios and Chansey. And Landorus Therian is still making a splash in both OU and VGC. It was once I think it still is the most common Pokemon to use in OU, simply because of its immense offensive support aspect, as well as its use as a defensive pivot and Stealth Rock setter. And in VGC, because of the Intimidate support being so important, and again, Landorus being one of those Pokemon like Garchomp that has no real bad stats, and with its immense attack stat, even if you use it for a bulky pivot, it'll still hit hard, as well as having probably the single most potent stab move, which is Earthquake, a move that has remained iconic since Gen 1. So yeah, Landorus is a Pokemon that made a splash in both Gen 5 VGC and OU, as well as Gen 6 VGC and OU, and will likely still be good for generations to come unless something just spectacular happens that puts Landorus in a bad spot in terms of viability, but I really don't see that coming. Just in general, the Kami Trio are, I think, like the most influential set of Pokemon, but Landorus in particular was the one that has impressed me the most, especially like VGC 2015 this year, in OU, both Landorus I and Landorus T being S ranked at one point, Landorus I being banned in Gen 5 OU, and Landorus T first making its mark in the tier. So for those reasons, despite only being released for 2 generations, I think Landorus is the most influential standard metagame Pokemon. Thank you for watching, and make sure you like and subscribe.